I'm Georgina Rose. I'm a perennialist and polytheist, and welcome to Pagan Perspectives. Pagan Perspectives is my podcast where I give a pagan, metaphysical, and esoteric perspective on mundane topics that appear in our lives. Basically, how can we understand the material world through esoteric philosophy and wisdom from many cultures, many traditions, and throughout human history? And in this episode, I'm going to be discussing diet, or I think better phrased as way of eating. So diet is the term that I think most people use when they're referring to what they eat. I do prefer the term way of eating just because I think it kind of summarizes, the holistic patterns of like what you eat a little bit better, but I will be using diet because it's a familiar term. And basically, what is the most spiritual diet to have? What, different religions say about food, right? What is banned, what is allowed. There's some famous discussions I'm going to get into, like if pork is bad, if eating cow is bad, if as spiritual people we should avoid meat, and if we should return to like a more ancestral way of eating, but also discuss other aspects of diet, such as how our different spiritual temperaments can affect our diet and religious practices like fasting. Now, to be clear, I am talking about spiritual perspectives on diet. This is not a weight loss podcast. That's not what I'm going to be getting into. I'm not going to be talking about how to like lose 20 pounds within a month or something. That's not really what I'm interested in. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm talking about spiritual perspectives on diet. I think if you are thinking about diet for weight loss, you should look somewhere different. Now, of course, I do think everyone should eat healthy and take care of their body. But yeah, this is not about like fitness. It's more about the spiritual nature of food. Now, if you do have a very uncomfortable relationship with food or disordered eating or something of that nature, this podcast, I think it might be, I'm complicated on what to say about this because part of me is like, you might want to avoid this discussion because, food can be a very sensitive topic. But at the same time, for people with unhealthy relationships to food, perhaps viewing food from the spiritual perspective instead of just how they affect their body shape could actually be a healing thing. So please use your own discretion and critical thought when deciding to listen to this if you have any of those tendencies. Just, take a little moment to examine your consciousness and consider if this is the best episode for you. Now, if you do not have that, let's get into this. So, when I think about spiritual ideas about eating, I think most people think of dietary restrictions. So there are some very famous dietary restriction sets from religion, specifically kosher and halal. So these come from the Abrahamic traditions, specifically the Jewish and the Islamic traditions, but there are many other dietary laws. In fact, pretty much all religions that have an exoteric or outward component have some sort of rule about food. There's really no religion that doesn't. It's just how many rules about food is what varies. Now, of course, no matter who you are, it is important to understand that physical, spiritual, and mental health are incredibly linked. If one of those is lacking, then the others will lack. So no matter what your religious beliefs are, no matter what tradition you follow, no matter what type of practitioner you are, it is important to take care of your physical body and take care of your mental health and of course have a solid spiritual practice. So, no matter which of these dietary laws you follow or believe in, you always need to take care of your health. Because the truth is, a lot of religious dietary laws are not really oriented towards health. Like they're more about avoiding things that are bad for your spiritual body. And of course, our body and mind and spirit are interconnected, but they're not exactly the same. Like whether you eat pork or not is really not going to make a huge impact on your physical health for most people. But for certain religions, there's a lot of ideas about what that means spiritually. So I want to look at kosher first because I think it is the most well-known dietary restrictions. And basically, it has this idea about avoiding mixing meat and dairy based on a verse in the Torah that says you cannot cook a baby in its mother's milk. So you cannot mix dairy and meat. This idea is really an anomaly. There's a lot of stuff in kosher dietary laws that you do not see in other religious traditions. There's a lot of them that are very distinct to that. And that would be one where, it doesn't really come up anywhere else. There also is a lot of ideas about kosher diet that it must be made in a facility that follows kosher laws and it must have stamps of approval and all this. Once again, that's pretty much unique to the Jewish tradition, though there are with meat certain labels that halal food has as well. Generally, and I'm going to get into this a bit, the big thing is there's a lot of ideas about unclean animals. And that's going to be a theme. This idea that you should not eat unclean animals is pretty consistent. So I would like to turn to halal because that's kind of how I'm going to segue into talking about unclean animals. So halal is the Islamic, halal technically is not the name of the diet. Halal means allowed, it means like legal. And so when you eat halal, you're eating legal food. The most famous ban within the Islamic religion is the ban against eating pork. The Jewish law and the Muslim law agrees on this. And we actually see a lot of pork taboos in other cultures as well. Specifically in the Celtic Isles, there are some taboos against pork. And I actually was sent this really interesting, historic article discussing how one of the distinctions between people in the Scottish Highlands and people in England was whether or not they ate pork, because the English eat a lot of pork, and people in the Scottish Highlands actually had like some weird theories about pork. They were kind of uncomfortable with it. It does seem to kind of have a little bit of a root in some actual diseases that spread. Like that seems to be kind of a common thing. I also saw that the Scythians were uncomfortable with pork as well. And so when it comes to the ancient Scythians, they don't even offer pork. They see it as just truly gross. And when we think about pigs, we are talking about like physically they are unclean animals, right? Like they live in like a little a little pen, and they roll around in their own shit, and they'll eat anything. They'll eat things that, we wouldn't eat. And pigs are known to carry some diseases. So this ancient pork taboo that we see so common, I think comes from two places. I think it comes from a genuine concern for hygiene and an idea, and this is kind of an animistic idea, is that the way an animal behaves represents its spirits. So in many ancient cultures, we see the idea of animal spirits. And when you look, especially if you look to Sumerian descriptions of demons and angels and whatnot, they're often kind of depicted as animals. You see this pretty consistently. Same with the Egyptians. If you look at Egyptian gods, right, they're drawn as animals. Anubis is like a kind of like dog. And, there's, ones like Sobek who are crocodiles, right? So this idea of like animals having a spiritual quality is pretty consistent. As well, in indigenous cultures in the North Americas, you see the idea of like spirit animals and totem animals. When you look to the Slavic world and you look to pre-Abrahamic Slavic carvings, you see these carvings that have animal faces on them. And when we look across Europe and we look at pagan festivals, we see animal masks used pretty consistently. So we understand that animals have spirits, and generally the way an animal act is how we get their animal spirit correspondence. So kind of the idea is, an animal is representing an archetype. They're representing a spirit. And if we consider like Jungian ideas, we understand that there are many, many archetypes, right? There is the archetype of the hunter, the archetype of the wanderer, the archetype of the mystic, the archetype of there's so many, right? I could go on and on and on. There's countless archetypes. There's the wild hunt. It's just, there's so many archetypes. And so we can slot animals based on their behavior into specific archetypes. Like that you can think how a mouse behaves, skittish, kind of dirty, carrying disease, but also nervous, would be a little bit different than the spiritual archetype of a lion, who represents strength and power and the ability to conquer and overcome. So when we look at animal behavior, we understand, okay, so that kind of represents its spirit. And since pigs do a lot of really gross things, you can get the idea that they could be unclean spirits. As well, after pigs give birth, it's very common for them to roll over and squash their piglets. So a lot of people just get ick vibes from pigs. And so because of this, they're like, okay, well, pigs are gross. They behave in gross ways. That means their spirit must be gross. And when we look at spirits that are sort of anthropomorphized pig spirits, they're not typically like guiding, loving, kind spirits. They're tricksters. They're kind of, deceitful. And so a lot of people have developed in a lot of cultures, though not all, specifically the Anglo world and the Nordic cultures didn't do this, kind of a discomfort with pigs. And so generally the idea of not eating pigs goes from, okay, so we're talking about an animal with an unclean spirit. what happens to me when I consume an unclean spirit? Because when we think about eating as an action, right, we are taking something and putting it into our body. And in a sense, when something enters your body, it is entering your spirit and, in a sense, possessing you. There was a specific idea coming out of modern sabbatic witchcraft from the cultus Sabbati, which is a traditional witchcraft organization that started, relatively recently. They're trying to bring back traditional witchcraft and like the sabbatic witch cult of Europe and all of this. Anyways, they kind of got into like plant mysticism. They were started by this guy Chumbly, who was very interested in dreams and dream initiations and the sabbatic spirit flight. And then they were taken over by this guy Schulke. And Schulke is a very important writer on herbalism and folk medicine, but specifically one of his concepts is phytonosis, or gnosis from plants. And he believes whenever you consume a plant or you interact with a plant, it is possessing you. So let's say you like drink mugwort tea. Obviously, mugwort tea is psychoactive. Of course, it doesn't make you like trip out and like have like a DMT vision or something, but it does give more, like I would say that your dreams basically get intensified. They're more vivid, they're more intense. Mugwort has been used historically for dream divination. So people would drink mugwort tea and then they would have really, really vivid dreams. And also, mugwort kind of makes you tired. It makes you a little bit relaxed. Like, I've drank mugwort tea many times, and for me, it makes me feel kind of tired, kind of sleepy. I sleep the deepest sleep I've ever had, and I have crazy dreams. And then I wake up and I'm like, okay, so that happened. And mugwort is associated with the archetype of the moon, of the intuition, of the feminine, of the psychic. And so, when I'm drinking mugwort tea, I am in a sense being physically possessed by the moon because it is overtaking my sensory perception of the world and my body. This is especially true if you ever use any sort of entheogen or psychedelic. When you consume a psychedelic, it overtakes you. Like, literally, it possesses you, especially ones that are very strong and elicit intense hallucinogenic effects, right? Honestly, this is true for everything, right? Of course, not a lot of things are not psychoactive, but when you consume something, it's possessing you. Same with scent. When you smell something, chemically, basically a molecule bonds to your nose, and that's all you can smell. That's why if you go to a perfume store and you spray a bunch of perfumes, they have you clear your palate before you smell more. So, when we're thinking about it, when something enters your body, it's possessing you in a way. And so, a lot of people found this idea of eating pig, something that is unclean, very, very uncomfortable. And so, it became a big taboo. Now, not all cultures buy into the idea that when you consume something, it affects you that way. And some would argue that our spirits are stronger than one sausage we're eating. And so, having a taboo around it is kind of silly. But I will say it's a pretty common belief, and I can see how you got there. Now, there are other unclean spirits that different cultures consider like gross, like eating bugs often has taboos around it because they're kind of gross. It's just there's quite a few different religions have problems with it. Some religions say eating bats or mice is, unclean for various reasons. Some people say that, eating like, say, like a vulture or like an animal that like scavages would be eating an unclean spirit, and that you would be consuming it. As well, like some religions have a ban on eating dogs. So yeah, like there's a lot of lists about this, but the most common is pork. So I did want to focus on that one. But you can apply that concept of impure animals to really any animal that's unclean or has like a dark spirit associated with it. Like, I don't know who's eating crocodile, but generally crocodile spirits are seen as very scary and threatening and dangerous. So if you ate crocodile, you could be bringing that energy into you. So just think about all of that. Now, there is also a taboo about eating blood in a number of religions, with the same logic, like it's unclean. Now, blood can carry pathogens, so I think that taboo also has like a physical health concern with it. But once again, just because some religions ban unclean animals doesn't mean all do. Some don't have a problem with it. Now, the other extreme, in terms of like animal eating restrictions, is basically banning eating sacred animals. So, most famously, the Hindu tradition has a big prohibition against eating cows and beef. And that's because the cow is the most sacred animal in the Hindu religion. And so, if you were to kill a cow and eat it, you are eating something very sacred. A bunch of religions have ideas of sacred animals, right? Pretty much every tradition does have these powerful animals that represent specific things. And so, if you were to, kill and then eat something so holy, that could be seen as a problem too, because you've killed something that's spiritually important just for your own consumption. And this idea can really be brought really extreme and taken really far. And that's how you get for religions that prescribe vegetarianism. So there are a number of religions, specifically ones from the East, that actually do ban eating meat or highly recommend not eating meat. I think once again, we're going to move towards Buddhism. I mean, I mentioned Hinduism before. Some Hindus, I will say, do believe you should be vegetarian, but it is more common in Buddhism. But all of those dharmic religions, you can come up with this. And the Buddhist argument is that when you eat an animal, you have to kill it, obviously. I mean, even if you're not the one like butchering it and going out in the woods and like cutting up the cow, like someone had to. And so there's a question about, the sanctity of life and the idea that it is not really our right to kill, animals and eat them. And in fact, some people even argue that when you kill an animal and eat it, you are actually accruing bad karma. You accrue the karma of murder towards that animal. And that, when it comes to these Eastern traditions, essentially karma is really important, because what your karma is that you accrue over the course of your life determines what happens in your next life. If you have bad karma in Buddhism, you might not even reincarnate as a human. You might reincarnate into a hell where temporarily you suffer for a long time to be purged of your bad karma. And so for many people who are Buddhist, abstaining from meat seems like the logical choice, because they don't want that bad karma and they don't think it's their right to take the life of another living being. It's kind of like a respecting life type argument. Now, there are other traditions that disagree. Some religions think that, killing animals is fine because we have domain over animals. Specifically in the Christian tradition, it is argued that there is nothing wrong with eating animals because we are, a higher being. Essentially, in the Christian tradition, the only, entity that has free will is humans. That is actually the sin of Lucifer in the Bible, is basically Lucifer rebelled. Lucifer, had free will in a sense, and it condemned him because only humans are supposed to have free will. And since we have free will and animals do not, animals are underneath us in the hierarchy of being. And so, you can eat animals whenever you want, except in specific periods of penance. So, I mean, it varies. Now, a lot of pagan traditions also eat animals and have this kind of argument, but there's also a different argument that some pagans make about the cycle of life, the idea that everything is life, death, and rebirth. And, inherently killing is part of life, right? The animals kill plants when they eat them, and then when we eat animals, we kill them, and then when we die and our corpses are buried underground, if we are buried, traditionally and not in a coffin or whatever, we are actually consumed by fungus, which then feeds the plants, and then the animals eat the plants, and then we eat the animals. And so in a sense, it's cyclical. This is the perspective that I personally think makes the most sense. Now, that perspective does posit that when you die, it is a moral obligation to be buried in a natural way in which you can be consumed by fungus to continue the cycle. Essentially, that by eating all of this, you've accrued a debt that you must repay. But that our death is valuable because even after we die, we are continuing the cycle. We are continuing life. We are giving back to the world. It is very cyclical. And in a sense, when one is buried naturally, they never die because, of course, their body is then part of a plant and part of an animal, right? That actual matter continues to exist. In a sense, the scientific argument that matter is neither created or destroyed is actually an argument for a form of reincarnation. It just might not be as literal as we often think. I think a lot of people think how reincarnation works is like you die and then baby is born with your soul. But in many traditions with reincarnation, you can be reincarnated as anything, as a tree, in the Buddhist tradition, you can actually be reincarnated essentially as a god, right? Or you can be reincarnated in hell, right? Like it all cycles around. And I do think this makes the most sense to me. But I think all these other arguments are still worth listening to. I think it's worth considering what are the thoughts on what we should be eating and how should we relate to that. Now, I don't know of a tradition that really thinks it's morally great to eat meat. I think there are just a lot that they think of that as an inevitable part of life. And when we look at regions especially far northern religions, like ones way up in the Great North, right? I mean, there wasn't a lot of plants that were grown. I mean, hunting was essential for survival. And so, trying to make a vegetarian argument to a tradition that is in a brutal northern winter, kind of hard to make. And so I think there's nuance in these conversations, and I think you should always consider your own beliefs. Now, another thing that can be discussed with meat is essentially how we get the meat matters. So there are a lot of people who do not subscribe to spiritual vegetarianism, but do think that our modern factory farming system is inherently wrong, and thus even though, eating meat and killing animals is not morally wrong, the way that we are doing it is so unnecessarily cruel that, partaking in that type of system is wrong, and you should look for ethical alternatives, and we should advocate against factory farming for a more traditional way of consuming animals. In a lot of indigenous traditions, what happened was when an animal was killed for food, their entire body was used. So then, it was multi-purpose. It was not like we're killing like 20 cows in a row to make ground beef. We're using every single component. And I find this a quite interesting idea. I like this. I think in general, I think we can all agree that, while I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarianism, I don't believe those philosophies are, necessarily like the way to live. I do think the way the meat industry is run is pretty atrocious. And I think we should all reflect on that and encourage a better culture. Now, another argument that comes from this is that we should return to ancestral ways of eating in order to, be more ethical and have those roots. And I see this position a lot in pagans and animists, where basically what we should do is we should look at like the diets our ancestors had and their practices around, getting meat, their practices around hunting, their practices around farming, and kind of move towards that more traditional way of operating so that we can be connected to our pagan roots and have a more ethical understanding of meat and farming. And I think that's a pretty interesting idea. Now, there are some pagans who get really into it and look into diets that are, exactly what their ancestors ate. There was a fad diet back in the early 2010s called paleo, where people were trying to eat like their like primitive Paleolithic ancestors for maximum health. And, I don't see that fad diet anymore, but I do see pagans discussing how we can eat in a way that is more ancestral and more in line with like what the ancient pagans did, as opposed to the modern diet that could be, using unethical practices and causing more diseases. So yeah, I think we should consider, how we're getting our meat, because, no matter what you believe, obviously animals are spirits and karma, is real. We should strive to be good people. So I think all of that is really worth exploring. So even if, you don't believe in meat taboos, you can believe in it being done in a better way. So, another thing that I think could be worth discussing in this conversation is fasting. So, fasting is a practice that is not like a way of eating or a diet, but it's so adjacent to this conversation, I think it fits, where basically you abstain from food for a period of time. So, the most famous fast that I think everyone knows about is the Ramadan fast. So, when I'm recording this, we are in the month of Ramadan, which is the Islamic holy month, where all Muslims fast from water and food from sunrise to sunset. Specifically from the sunrise prayer to the sunset prayer. It's the prayer times, not exactly like the movements of the heavens. And the reason why that is done is a number of reasons, and this generally applies to fasting all around. It's to build humility, build empathy for people who do not have food, and to challenge yourself for something spiritual. In general, fasting or abstaining from food is to challenge yourself, but it can also be about purity. And, I mentioned that Muslim way of fasting, but that Muslim way of fasting is not the only way fasting presents. In fact, a lot of fast can seem not very difficult. Specifically in the Christian tradition, they fast from all meats excluding fish. Yes, Christianity claims that fish is not a meat. I think they're wrong. I'm trying to just discuss these things objectively, but fish is obviously a meat, and I will not take any criticism on that. Fish is a meat. I even saw like on Twitter someone saying that like beavers are not a meat, and I was like, why are you eating beavers? I have a lot of questions. But anyways, on Fridays, Catholics are supposed to. They technically aren't required to because of the way the church has changed over time, but they're recommended to, fast from everything but fish and non-meat on Fridays. And then there are specific mandatory fast days in the Catholic calendar. I believe the Orthodox do something similar. I personally, my Christian background is Protestant. I was Protestant before I became a pagan and an occultist, so I did not grow up with any of these traditions. I actually, when I was a kid, I thought the only difference between like Catholics and like Protestants was just like Catholics eat more fish. So yeah, the Protestantism I grew up around did not have any concept of fasting. But the reason why fasting is done in the Christian tradition is to be a penance and to purify yourself. If we look to pagan traditions, we see fasting as a form of purification as the most common reason. So obviously, when you abstain from food, you are testing yourself, you are doing an act of asceticism, and you're doing an act of sacrifice. Common ways fasting is done is not avoiding all water and food. I mean, I really think the Islamic tradition is unique on the no water thing. I know Jewish fasting is full fasting. I don't know if they avoid water or not off the top of my head. They might. But yes, pagan fast definitely allowed water. In fact, a lot of them allowed like bland food. So a common thing you'll see, and you actually see this in the popular Western esoteric grimoire, the Melon. And the Melon, very important, impactful grimoire. It's where the idea of the holy guardian angel comes from. And it's this long, explanation of how you get your holy guardian angel through this long period of asceticism and penance. And it recommends fasting the entire time. But the way that it fasts in the Melon is you eat like bread, water, rice, no seasoning, and nothing pleasurable. So you just basically eat the food you need to live. And I see that quite commonly in pagan traditions. There also are times when people just fast from meat because meat is more pleasurable. So once again, the deriving of pleasure is a goal of a lot of fasting. And when it comes to purity fasting, you could avoid specific things. Like I know a lot of people will fast from intoxicants. And intoxicants are adjacent to the dietary conversation. And by intoxicants, I mean caffeine, alcohol, and psychoactive drugs. So alcohol is a wildly debated topic in religion. In traditions like Nordic paganism, obviously drinking mead is a very sacred act. In Christianity, wine is drank as the ultimate sacrifice to Jesus. And I mean, if we look at a lot of pagan rituals, wine is heavily used. The cult of Dionysus in Greece would use wine as an entheogen. Wine is a way to connect to Dionysus. And this is why a lot of Gnostics connect Dionysus to Jesus. There's this really fascinating religious theory that Jesus is like the Dionysian cult, but right-hand path, which is just fascinating. It's a cool rabbit hole to go down. I mean, I don't really know if I agree with this theory. I mean, I don't really think I agree with this theory, but it is an interesting one. But anyways, yes. So alcohol is sacred in a lot of traditions. Now, obviously, being an alcoholic who like throws back 4 bottles of vodka a day and has withdrawals when they don't drink, that's not holy in any religion. Addiction is a disease. Addiction is an affliction, and addiction is something that people suffer with. So when I say alcohol is holy in some traditions, I do not mean alcoholism. I mean using alcohol in a specific ritual context. But there are other religions that have a huge prohibition on alcohol. I would say Islam, again, has, I mean, the most obvious ban on alcohol, but I can think of some, pre-Abrahamic traditions that are weird about it, right? And I know specifically for some rituals, when people do their purification period beforehand, they will eat non-pleasurable things and they won't drink. They'll be like, okay, I'm putting down this hard ciders for a week in order to prepare for this important initiation I'm doing, right? So alcohol, it's interesting because, we're talking about something that affects your mind. It puts you in an altered state of consciousness. And obviously, when we're doing ritual work, we're doing mysticism, entering an altered state of consciousness is a huge part of a lot of practices. Going into that different state of mind allows us to transcend. A big problem with mysticism is that we are always in our mind. We're always focused on something. We're thinking about our grocery list or what we're going to do next or what reality TV show we're going to watch tonight or, did I go on my run for long enough? You know what I'm saying? We have all these mundane concerns that are like running through our minds. And when we enter an altered state of consciousness, whether that's through dance, a static ritual, chanting, singing, or something like alcohol, it does break that thought pattern so that we can focus more on the ritual. And obviously, when you're in an altered state of consciousness, you experience your outside sensory perceptions differently, which can allow you to interact with spirits differently. And things like alcohol, when we're using them in a ritual context, completely shift your mindset. Whereas some traditions, do not like intoxicants. They see it as hedonistic. They see it as taboo. Most traditions that embrace asceticism are not cool with you going out and drinking a bunch of beer on the weekend, right? But if you're part of a pagan tradition that doesn't have a taboo against that, that's fine. So alcohol, once again, a contentious idea. Caffeine, most religions don't have a problem with caffeine. If anything, caffeine is a cognitive enhancer, but I know specifically Mormons avoid caffeine. They consider it a drug. All these things are worth exploring too. Like having an understanding of your thoughts on intoxicants can be interesting. And there is a perspective that some people have where on a day-to-day basis, you should not interact with intoxicants. You should not, remain as sober-minded, as straight edge as possible. But then when it comes to, doing, say, a ritual to Dionysus or doing, a night where you dance for hours and hours and hours to a god where, drinking black tea might help you get through that. I know there are specific Sufi groups where they throw back Turkish tea all night so that they can keep whirling, right? You know, That is a perspective too. I know a lot of people feel that way about psychedelics and entheogens. I personally think using psychedelics outside of a spiritual context can be disruptive to the mind, but using them in a spiritual context with a shaman and with proper precautions can be a powerful initiatory experience. So if you have that kind of perspective, you could say, okay, outside of ritual bad, in ritual good. And I think that's a nuance that can be allowed. Now, another perspective on food is the idea that different people have different diets that they need, right? That we're not all the same. And logically I think this makes sense, because like if you've ever looked at like people who are actually like dieting for weight loss or health, people have all sorts of different ideas on like what is best. And I think that comes from the fact that people genuinely just seem to do different ways on different diets. Like for some people, keto seems really good. For some people, they do well with veganism. And then you see people who go vegan and then they end up with extreme nutritional deficiencies, or people who go keto and then they have, serious problems. So I think part of this can be explained with the spiritual idea that different diets are meant for different people. The most comprehensive system of this is known as Ayurveda. So Ayurveda comes from, as you can guess, the Vedas. So essentially, the Vedas are the ancient Hindu scripture, and it basically says that there are three doshas, or main energies, that make up us as people, and they correspond to the elements. So if you're into Vedic astrology, you can see how this is really quick. And basically, everyone has a dominant dosha, but many people have like two dominant doshas. Basically, there's like a balance, but there's definitely one that's the strongest. So people will be like Vata slash Pitta, Pitta, Kapha, or maybe just Pitta. Anyways, I'm going to go through what they are. So the three are Vata. So the Vata dosha is very much about air. It is, active. It's kind of mercurial, and it is one of the main doshas. Now, the next one, this is my dominant dosha. If you're like me, hell yeah. And that is the Pitta dosha. And that is the one that is most associated with fire. It is hot. And then there is the Kapha dosha, which is the one associated with earth. And you can actually figure out which of these based on your temperament. The Vata dosha is a thin frame, sensitive to cold. And it's associated with certain physical conditions. The Kapha is the larger build, struggles with cold, slower digestion. And there's actually personality traits that relate to these. So the idea of the four temperaments in the West: choleric, phlegmatic, melancholic, and sanguine, which is a big thing in early Western psychology, I feel like parallels these really well. Then, of course, Pitta is like a medium build, kind of high energy, very passionate, aggressive. And, if you know the Western temperaments, I would say Pitta is very choleric, which is interesting. I'm a choleric as well. And actually, I talked to an Ayurveda practitioner who confirmed I am a Pitta. So Pitta gang, I guess. And Kapha, it really reminds me of the phlegmatic, and Vata reminds me of the melancholic. I would say the sanguine is probably also Pitta, but you can have any combination of these at different, levels. And basically what it argues is, depending on which is your dominant dosha, you basically have a specific diet based on that. Like there are certain foods that are better for each dosha. There are certain even exercises that are better for each dosha. And so these three types of people have completely different, things they should be eating, and certain herbs they should be using. And so you can really get a lot of information off that. Like we're not all the same. Our physical and psychological tempers affect what we should be eating and what we shouldn't be eating. So yeah, it's very interesting stuff. There's a lot of like recipes around it. I really like Ayurveda because it's just so comprehensive. But basically that idea, you can apply that further, right? Like if you think about the planets in the sky, like the astrological heavenly bodies, right? People are always ruled by planets. Like for me, I'm a Leo rising, so I'm ruled by the sun. And so that would mean, certain things about what exercises and diets I should be doing, much like the doshas. As you can see, there's an elemental correspondent with the planets and with the doshas. And so based on, the element associated with your rising sign, you could probably extrapolate what your dosha is pretty quickly, or your Mars sign even, or whatever's going on in the house of health in terms of like houses on your chart. You could get a lot of information from that. The planetary ruler of the house of health for you, I think, could be a big insight into that. But generally, yes, there is definitely a belief in some cultures that we don't all need the same diet. We don't all need the same nutrition. And that actually tracks with recent scientific discoveries, because if you've ever taken one of those, DNA tests to figure out your ancestry, also they include a lot of information about your health if you pay a little bit more. And if you get the health information, it actually can give dietary recommendations. Like I remember when I took a DNA test, I re-uploaded my DNA file to this website, and it told me basically what type of foods I'm going to crave based on my genetic information. And it was pretty accurate, honestly. So I definitely think it's worth considering that, perhaps we all have different dietary needs based on who we are, because obviously who you are at the moment of birth is when, your soul comes into this world, and when a lot of things are determined for you, just like with astrology. I mean, your psychology and your life is largely determined for you based on that. And so why would diet be any different? Now, of course, the interesting thing about religious laws about diet is when we're looking at what's best for us, they often can overlap. So, if you believe in, say, a pork taboo, but you have a specific dosha diet you should have based on Ayurveda, you could eat that diet and continue with adhering to a no pork taboo. Now, of course, when it comes to fasting periods, that may not be true. But the thing is, fasting is not permanent. Intermittent fasting or whatever, that's not a spiritual discipline. That's just like a fad diet. Like, spiritual fasting is just about purifying, and it's about temporary stuff. And honestly, I've mentioned fasting quite a bit in this podcast. I do think fasting needs to be done very carefully, because there's a lot of physical health conditions, things like pregnancy, things like being on your period, things like blood sugar issues that can make religious fasting never worth it. And I remember I had a conversation with someone who wanted to do the Abramelin ritual, but I think they had diabetes. I don't remember. They had some sort of like health condition that made them really worried about the food restriction component of the Abramelin ritual. And I told them, I'm like, skip it. I know that's not exactly what the ritual says, but you need to put your health first. And so when it comes to religious fasting, I genuinely think you should talk to a doctor before you do it. I know people say that as like advice and nobody listens to it, but with religious fasting, I actually do think you should listen to that, because, the thing is, disrupting your physical health for a spiritual reason is not a spiritual thing to do. If you cannot do something because it will hurt you, you should not do it. Same with psychological stuff. I have talked to some people who have passed with eating disorders, and they have talked to me about, they want to convert to some religion, and the religion has a lot of rules around food, and they're freaked out by it. And they might have to do mandatory fasting for some ritual. And every single time I tell them not to do it, because your psychological and your physical health affects your spiritual health so greatly that if you tank them for spiritual health, what's going to happen? You're going to tank your spiritual health too. I remember when I was in a health class, when I was in middle school, of all places, I still can't believe this was a middle school health class lesson, but it was brilliant. And it's affected my thinking to this day. The teacher drew a triangle on the board, and one said spiritual, physical, mental. I don't think this was in the curriculum. She kind of went off the curriculum all the time, but this was a good lesson. And she said that they all need to be balanced to be a perfect triangle. For you to be happy, you must be a perfect triangle. And when one corner goes away, it's no longer a triangle, right? Like, you're suffering, you're struggling. So if there is any reason why you cannot do dietary rules around food, don't do them. It is not worth destroying yourself to have some sort of spiritual goal. The point of spirituality is to get as close to our true will, and get close to gnosis, and get close to virtue, and reunite with the gods. That's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to achieve. Every religion has some concept like this. You can call it heaven, you can call it nirvana, you can call it gnosis, whatever the hell you want to call it. We're talking about the same thing. And if you destroy yourself in the process of trying to do that, it will not happen. So there is never, ever a point where it is worth disrupting your health to get some spiritual goal. Not worth it. So that aside there, I think another thing you must consider, and this is, what you want. So I've thrown a lot of information at you on this podcast about like ways of eating and diets and thoughts. And, I want you to sit with that and consider your true will. So in Thelema, the Western esotericism tradition that comes from Aleister Crowley, there is this really important idea called true will. And this idea predates Thelema a bit. It's called pure will or willpower in many other traditions. And it represents like basically the idea that we are born into this world with a destiny that we must uncover through interactions with the gods. And the true will is basically like our higher purpose. It's our path in life. It's our path towards greatness, our path towards gnosis. And every single time we make a decision, we are actually interacting with our true will. So there's an activity before eating that Thelemites do called saying will, where you say this little thing, and it basically asks you, why are you eating and drinking? And you say, oh, it's because I want to nourish my body so I can do my true will. Right? And it's a little bit longer than that. That's, of course, a simplification of a whole little like pre-meal exercise. But it is a good lesson, because I'm throwing all this information at you, but you need to consider when you're talking about how you form your way of eating, your diet, your nutritional plan, is this in alignment with my true will? Because just because a religion does something doesn't mean that's a part of your true will, doesn't mean that's a part of your path. So you should consider, what gods do I worship? What does my practice look like on a day to day? What are my philosophical beliefs? What are my moral beliefs? And what is my true will telling me? So I really recommend sitting and contemplating and thinking over your thoughts on all of these subjects about food, about diet, about restrictions, about impurity, and about holy animals. And then with all of that information there, contemplating your true will, and from that, making a path on how to have the best way of eating possible for your lifestyle. And of course, in line with your health needs, because, we all have different physical health conditions, and you want your spiritual health to be in line with your physical health. So that's all I have to say in this episode. Consider your true will, and make sure your diet is what you actually want to be doing and is sustainable and healthy for you. I'm Georgina Rose, or Dot Darling. This podcast is supported on Patreon. If you join the Patreon, you get a bonus episode every Neo-Pagan Sabbath, and a bonus pre-show every single episode. If you want to support me, I am Georgina Rose, or Dot Darling. I'm on every platform under the sun, and on YouTube mostly under Dot Darling. I also am a professional astrologer and tarot reader. I have my website linked in the show notes or in the description, where you can book a reading yourself. Whether you want tarot or whether you want astrology, I can do both. And of course, I have my own Patreon where I sell ritual guides, mentorship sessions where I can guide you through your spiritual path, and give extra videos and early access to my YouTube videos. So yeah, with all of that, have a great day, night, afternoon, mid-morning, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Please like, comment, and subscribe, or rate and review the podcast if you're on a podcasting platform, and I'll see you all in the next one. This has been Pagan Perspectives by Georgina Rose. Bye!